everyone, and welcome to fifth episode of Agile Fridays, which is powered by Koji for Agile. Koji for Agile is a project management insights platform which connects people, strategy, and operations. Agile Fridays, we are hosting this series of talks, to spread awareness about data-driven decisions and to encourage the culture of enterprise agility. And I'm very excited to host Craig Coburn on Agile Fridays today. Coburn has been working with Agile practices for over 10 years now. He's originally a software engineer and he's based in Edinburgh, where he works as freelance Agile coach. Craig is an active member of Agile community and is a founding committee member of the BCS Agile Specialist Group. Craig also helps to support Agile community events in Scotland. And I was going through Craig's profile, very impressive profile personally. I mean, he's been doing a lot in his career. Craig has worked as a scrum master, as a development lead, an Agile coach across so many different sectors, particularly public sector and banking. He wrote the UK's first guide to getting online, invented an early browser, and he's credited on the acknowledgements for HTML5 and in the book Agenda Shift by Mike Burrows. Recently, Craig has been one of the advisors and early supporters of the Agile 2.0 Festival and is co-author of Agile: An Unexpected Journey, which is available through Amazon. So thank you so much, Craig, and I hope I spelled it right. Agile 2.0 Festival, or is it Agile 20?
Yeah, so that was the Agile 20 Reflect Festival,
Right.
And that was back in February because it was 20 years since the Agile Manifesto was signed, and we were marking that with a variety of events all around the world in multiple languages. So, thanks for the intro. So here I am. This is Edinburgh Castle behind me. So I'm based in Edinburgh in Scotland, and it's nice to be able to chat to you this evening.
Right. All right. Thank you once again for joining us. So Craig, let me just set the context for choosing this topic. Let me just give some background of this topic, and then I'll ask you the first question. We'll try to wrap this up in 25 minutes or so. So why we decided to have this topic of Agile strategy today? Everyone knows that Agile is the new norm. I mean, I'm not breaking any news here. Agile is here to stay. And I was going through this McKinsey survey last week, which said that 93% units which had adopted Agile before COVID, they outperformed those units which had not adopted Agile before the COVID, before the entire COVID episode. So now we know that Agile is a new norm. Historically, there was this slow adoption, but we have been seeing a major uptake in Agile, especially in the last decade. Let's say starting 2009 and onwards, and especially in the last 5 years, there has been most Agile adoption. So my the reason that we went with this topic today, when so much Agile adoption is happening, especially in the last 5 years, it is quite natural, it is quite intuitive for companies to question if they have developed the right Agile strategy. And so we'll put these questions on the table for Coburn. So organizations struggling to find answers on this topic, if they are choosing the right strategy, if they're implementing the right strategy, they can get more clarity around this topic. And today we are going to discuss what are different components of Agile strategy and what are different do's and don'ts. So this is why we choose this topic. And Craig, my first question is, let's start with basics. Let's start with different components of Agile strategy. What are different components of Agile strategy, and which ones are most important in your opinion? Say, if I have to ask you, what is the linchpin of entire Agile strategy in an organization?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I've been working as an enterprise Agile coach for a few years, and I became particularly interested in Agile strategy a few years ago. And partially that was just my on-the-ground experience, but it was also the data coming out from the State of Agile report, the Business Agility Institute, of things that were just generally going wrong in the world of Agile, and people just doing Agile rather than being Agile, and using waterfall practices So the strategic thinking was poor. There's a lot of like copy and paste, just do it, or it's trendy. And there was no real sort of thinking around what's this going to get us. Now, as you pointed out correctly there, the organizations that were already agile and COVID hit, they were able to pivot and adapt. That's a really key thing about agile. You can pivot and adapt for minimal cost or minimal time. You maybe got the right tooling in place already. All these things are great. Agile is about being able to pivot. But this is the thing that people often say is to the fore, right? It's about being able to pivot. That's important. But the other thing that maybe they don't talk about as much is two things. One is that half the manifesto values are actually about people. That often gets overlooked, right? It's about individuals and interactions and customer collaboration. Half of the values are about people. Let's not lose sight of that because it's half the manifesto. And the other part about Agile is about proactive thinking. It's about having flexible roadmaps. It's about anticipating what could happen in the future. Because if something's already happened, well, the situation's on top of you, right? But if you are anticipating the things that could happen in the future and you're getting ready and you're even shaping the market or have a plan B ready, that's agile too, because you're helping to drive that change rather than always reacting to a change. Might be COVID, might be something else, or it might be your competitor, right? You want to be on top of the game and have a balance of both proactive and reactive. And what I see as well, particularly when it comes to strategy, is it's often felt it's reserved for the C-suite. It's just the people at the top. But guess what? That's a silo too. And often we talk about breaking down silos in Agile. Silos can be vertical, but they can also be horizontal, just the people at the top, right? They have a particular mindset, particular way of thinking, might all be from the same background. So what we want is diversity of thought and recognizing that strategy is for everybody, right? You know, I mean, the Agile Manifesto was written in 2 days. It doesn't have to be just about big stuff that takes 5 years. It can be about small stuff. If we all start thinking about transparent strategy and all able to inspect and adapt the strategy and it lines up, that's going to be much better for everybody. So I'd say those are the main things, and key: transparency, situational awareness and accounting for people and the impact of change on them.
Right. So, right. So, thank you so much for saying that. That's power packed with a lot of advice, and that connects with some of the questions that I'm going to ask down the road in this podcast. Especially, I mean, this. So, established companies, they try to be more agile. It's not impossible, we know, but it is tricky and it requires a lot of detail. And that is also because agile development cannot stand alone. It has to be woven into the fabric of organizations. I mean, people say that processes, system, data, people, they have to interact with each other to deliver value. So is it all easier said than done, Craig?
I think that, I mean, there's a diagram called the Agile Onion. It talks about things like tools and processes. They support and assist, but really what we want to get to is mindset, value shift, culture shift. These are the harder things that take longer. And Agile is not just about software, right? Okay, it was written by a bunch of software engineers, but very quickly afterwards, and also mentioned in the values to them are about people anyway, but very quickly afterwards realized it wasn't just about software, it's about people collaborating in organizational culture. And culture is hard to change. And the other thing that's hard to change is legacy culture, and with all the legacy stuff that goes with it. Massive amounts of technical debt that have been accumulated. They're like dragging a dead weight behind you, trying to be agile. Whereas you've got to really address that early on. Otherwise, it's just going to keep on holding you up the whole time. And a lot of these companies that are now talking about agile transformations, adopting agile, are the ones that weren't agile before, accumulated vast amounts of technical debt. And so that's like the main thrust of their early adoption, as well as, of course, the leadership shift. We see this in the State of Agile report. It's about leadership. It's about leadership attitude, leadership culture, leadership behaviors, being able to call things out, being able to challenge assumptions, having psychological safety, but also knowing how to make psychological safety happen. Because unless it does, it's just like, well, let's have some more tools or let's do some more processes. And you only get partial benefit, to be honest. It's really, we see a lot of transformations not realizing the full value because all people do is focus on, frameworks for teams and the teams and the teams of teams, and not really thinking full stack, top to bottom, the whole organization, and spending enough time in shifting the culture.
Right. So, I mean, talking about this leadership, generally we have seen that traditionally C-suite, the C-suite, they assume that it is their job to develop strategy and get it, implemented through tier two leadership. But like you said, Agile is more about empowering people and including them in the key discussions. I mean, so there is a break from traditional approach here. Do you think that this non-alignment of strategic goals, non-alignment between the strategic goals and objectives of smaller business units, they generally result in failed strategy implementation in case of Agile?
Yeah, well, I think that, leadership has a key role. Leadership leads the culture change. Leadership sets the big goals, the vision, and then that, percolates and aligns throughout the whole organization. But it's as much from the bottom up, because people close to the action can discover things. That should then feed up. This is what happens in an OKR model when it works well, is that ideas are flowing in both directions. It's not just about top down, it's about leadership, playing the right role of leadership and being servant leadership where needed. And I think that it's about, the leadership recognizing that they don't have all the answers. They can set the outcomes, and the outcomes can cascade down, and it leaves the teams to then say, well, what's the best way of us addressing that outcome in the most efficient way? So what we do need is alignment and autonomy. We want to empower teams, but we don't want everybody just going off doing their thing. So this is why we need transparency, because transparency supports alignment, and it also makes it transparent if there's gaps, or if there's duplication, or if there's waste. And really, one of the Kanban principles is just be transparent. So this is why I say strategy is whole organization, and it's about transparency top to bottom, rather than just static strategies from above saying this is what we're going to do. Because typically one of the failures is when you look at roadmaps, although it's flexible planning, the roadmap's generally linear. It's like a Gantt chart that's been flattened out. These are the stages we're going to go through, right? And that's not what Agile is about. It's about understanding that things could change. So visualizing the options and what your competitors are doing and what your biggest threat might be and why you need to do this now and what might happen if you don't. It's all that complexity, not just a straight line saying, here's what you're going to be doing for the next 12 months.
Right. So, I'll come back to this transparency thing, because this is extremely important. And as I said in the introduction, there's so many corporations, organizations, they are now adopting Agile, and this traditional approach is if it still persists there and there's no transparency. So since this is one of the most important things in Agile strategy implementation, we'll definitely come to this. But just to close the discussion on more challenges in adopting Agile, like you said, people in companies, they have their legacies after all. In your experience working with organizations, we talked about ownership, we talked about leadership, we talked about other things. In your experience, where else did you find most challenges for organizations in adopting a good Agile strategy and developing it and implementing it?
Yeah, it's technical debt and addressing that and making it visible. It's about leadership, not accepting that leadership is part of the solution and often saying it's just about the teams. And it's not even necessarily measuring the right thing. Often organizations adopt Agile just to simply save costs, look good at the next quarterly report and up the share price. Well, okay, there's some value there, but it's not long-term enough, right? And the ones that really benefit are the ones that start thinking long-term. So I'd want to see sort of evidence of long-term thinking. Now, of course, we talk about outcomes in Agile, and sometimes in big organizations, it takes a while to get a meaningful outcome and meaningful change. So if we're looking at saying like what's working, what's not working, is there any early indicators we can point to? So what is it you're measuring? What is it you're interested in? Where do you see the benefit of Agile, and what benefits is it going to bring you? And where are you now? Are you measuring things like flow metrics? Are you measuring innovation? Are you measuring engagement? Are you doing any innovation? Are you forcing Agile on people, or are you inviting them? What's the culture actually like? Do you measure any outcomes at the minute, or are you just measuring Jira tickets moved across the board or whatever tool you happen to be using? Are you measuring things that genuinely matter to your customers, or is it just of interest to line managers? Let's not, I mean, I see a lot of teams still fixated on how many story points they delivered. Well, the customer doesn't care. The customer cares about outcomes. So it's about the right conversations, the right metrics, the right thing. And actually, are those conversations happening? Are silos being broken down? Is thinking transparent? So when a leader says something, are people saying, yeah, but why did you say that? Or have you considered this? Are people able to challenge? So there's lots of things you can look for. And a lot of it is down to kind of either dysfunction or even just solving yesterday's problems rather than tomorrow's problems.
Right. So are you saying that Agile is a package? It comes with a lot of things. It comes with tracking these, let's say, different story points. So sorry, just getting to the depth of it. But it comes with a lot of different packages like ERPs, like a package which has got everything, and then you got to pick and choose which one is best for you.
I mean, different metrics will be important to different organizations, but you've got to really agree what are the metrics that genuinely matter. Measure what matters. And those things must matter to customers and ultimately to the organization rather than vanity metrics. And also just pick a small set, because if you start measuring too many things, you just get lost in the noise.
Right. So you got to keep the focus right while you're measuring. Okay, so let's talk about the implementation part, and I'll ask you different questions around the implementation. Now that we have just talked much about these problems and the source of these problems. So while developing Agile strategy, Craig, how do you think feedback loops and success metrics can be developed? You said that we got to focus. We should be focusing on the right metrics and the right KPIs. So how these successful metrics can be developed? Let's say, what can be different North Star? Is it the company's North Star that will determine which will be success metrics in our Agile strategy? I'll appreciate if you can share an example from your experience.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, what I see, and in my experience, certain organizations I work for, they genuinely don't have very many feedback loops. I mean, they're doing their sprint reviews, they're getting feedback from stakeholders, but then, weeks or months might pass before it's deployed, it goes out to customers, but they don't genuinely measure the thing that matters. Like, how did it go down with customers? What did the customer say? And then the bringing that metric data back to the conversation to help shape your roadmap. And then that data then filtering back up. It's like, it's limited feedback and it's partial. And also, examples of other feedback loops are things like, well, how big is your backlog? And is it growing? And what are you doing about that? Because constantly saying yes to stakeholders just ends up with a backlog that's months or even years long. Well, that's a feedback loop too. It's an early insight that things will take months to deliver, or maybe you don't have enough people on the team, or maybe people are just saying no, or that's not important enough. All these things are kind of feedback. And it's like bringing that feedback to the conversation so that you can pivot and so that you can learn. Because some of the biggest success stories we've seen have been unexpected discoveries. Well, this went unexpectedly well, therefore we should scale that up. Let's abandon the first go. Well, that was valuable, but this new thing's even more valuable. Well, that's the feedback that then maybe allows you to expand out into new opportunities. And also other things about feedback. I mean, I come back to people, right? How do your people feel? Because sometimes in the middle of doing Agile and job changes and role changes and transformation changes, the people can get very frustrated, feel a bit disillusioned, and really we want that feedback of how engaged is the workforce, because otherwise you're really kind of talking to people that aren't genuinely listening. You've got to bring people on that journey and take feedback as you go for how the organization is doing. Otherwise, things just get stuck.
Right. And what are different early signs that an organization can say that we are now starting to get on the right track? Is it, like you said, people taking the ownership of entire thing?
Yeah, I mean, You're right. I encourage doing surveys regularly. You've got retrospectives, but probably monthly surveys with squads or quarterly surveys, and surveys at every level of the organization. Because remember, it's not just about squads. How do the people feel? And are the things that give us early insight changing? We want that early insight, but we also want to get the late insight after the product's deployed. So we've got validation of value. So it's things like, the sort of metrics I go for are flow metrics, which is flow load, how many at once, flow capacity, how many items in a particular time, lead time, cycle time. The other thing is flow distribution, which is what is the kind of work we are doing? Is it tech debt? Is it innovation? Is it strategic initiatives over the longer term? Is that changing across time? Is it bugs? So what is the nature of the work that's going, and is that changing? And is it moving in the direction we want it to go? As well as obviously sensing on the ground what people are saying. And I suppose a very useful metric is even just saying, how many assumptions have we made, and where's the data, right? Because when you're a product owner and you're prioritizing your backlog, you want to prioritize in value, right? You don't always have that data, but even just visibly calling out, I don't have this here and it's an assumption, and I do have it here and it's validated data, brings that out and say, well, is there any assumptions we can validate soon through an experiment or an MVP? So at least you're calling out where the assumptions are, because those are potentially risks if they sit there for too long. And having that data of where are the assumptions and can they be challenged, that's useful too.
Okay, right. So I'll definitely come to this data part, because it is like it is one of the most important things. Just to elaborate on that, I actually wanted more opinion on that. So you've been working with public sector, you've been working with banking sector. So there are services sector in most cases, and then on the other hand, say there is a tech firm which is developing a product, an innovation-based product. Now, do you agree that in both of these cases, in services sector, in this product innovation sector, the early signs they have to be different?
Yeah, well, I think, the difference, the public sector was an early adopter of Agile. Now, generally, the public sector doesn't have much competition. It's much more about digital shift, about quality of service, about saving costs, and that was the main benefit there. Whereas in the private sector, it's much more about competitive advantage, or certainly it should be, right? It's often about cost as well. But in the private sector, it's a different picture about what might the competition do, and are we discussing that enough? So different sorts of factors at play there, really.
Right. So that is public versus private. Now in private, say there's a services sector and then there's fraud sector. I'm just trying to see if I'm a tech company doing this product innovation, and if I'm trying to choose agile strategy, and I go by the book, I do all those things right. I set a procedure, I set these scrums, I set these sprints in all. What are different things that, let's say, in first 30 days that can, if you are evaluating as an independent person, you'll say that we are going on the right track?
Yeah, well, the one thing that people don't talk about enough is, what is our biggest threat? And often, if you were to ask that question, it's a competitor in the same industry. And people then don't talk about disruptors. Now, what a disruptor is a different industry competing for the same customers. It's like Uber's a service platform, disrupted taxi companies. Airbnb is an accommodation platform, disrupted hotels. They weren't in that business. They don't have taxis, they don't have hotels. They sell that product to the same customers. So that's disruption. It's a different adjacent industry now competing for the same business. And that's perhaps the biggest threat. So really, I would say, like, are you talking about, do you know what your biggest threat is? And are you talking about that enough? And are you doing anything about that biggest threat? And are you doing it quickly enough?
Right. Okay. Right. So yes, that's an interesting discussion. It requires a completely different, completely separate podcast, because there are so many.
Those are the companies that put you out of business, right? And not talking about that as a major fault. Right.
We are only 45 episodes away from 50 podcasts. So we'll be having these in one of our future podcasts. So we touched data briefly, and so yes, Agile is about people, it is about processes, but it is also about these different components. So I want your opinion on this, and I would like to include software part in this as well.
Yeah.
My question is, how do you think is data important while developing this strategy? Because we have seen a lot of project and operations management tools now. They produce so much data, which is sometimes noise as well. And so do you think this data can play some part in developing, or let's say improvising your agile strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it does depend on the nature of what you're doing. I mean, I worked in online gambling where page load times in microseconds actually made the difference of how many customers you got, right? And data matters. But actually, one of the errors I see is somebody's focusing too much on one thing, like speed or number of deployments, and actually generally it's a basket. So pick that basket of balancing metrics that make sense. There's no point in going faster if, for instance, your quality suffers. There's no point in deploying something quickly if it's not actually what customers want and you're not getting the right feedback. So consider a relevant basket of core metrics and then add to those if you feel that that's important. It may be that there's core metrics for the company, and then maybe there's additional metrics for particular products. I mean, you would want to always evaluate, say, a product against your competitors. What are they doing right? But you also want that bigger picture of what are the industry trends, where might things go in the future, and what are the new opportunities that a disruptor might be seeing, and are you willing to move into that space too? So some of it is about just research, and some of it is about on the ground data, so you can react quickly.
Right. Okay. Yeah, data-driven decision is what we have been following this theme for so many podcasts. The next question, and actually we are left with final two questions, because we promised that we'll wrap this in 25 minutes or 30 minutes. So this question is important, and I want your feedback on this. So there is, do you agree that Agile requires dynamic capabilities? I mean, when we think of Agile, we think of all those dynamic capabilities, and we think of startups doing that perfectly. But do you agree that it requires stability as well? I mean, a stable backbone which can serve as anchor point while the change is happening around it. So do you think that a stable backbone and dynamic capability, they both go hand in hand? You cannot really just choose the other end of spectrum overnight and try to drive your organization in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, let's face it, let's not do Agile by Big Bang, right? Because that's waterfall. It's too much in one go, and it's also a complex problem. So you wouldn't want to do it in one go. You'd want to test and learn. So there's a combination here, and it's about the right approach. And of course, too much change all in one go makes people feel unsettled and stressful, and that has an impact too. So what I'd say is just get the right balance. Understand where your guardrails are, right? It's like driving on a road. You've got to steer within the road. If you go too much off that, then there's a problem. But just understanding what the limits are that you're wanting to steer within, and to steer within that, and say, like, keep the show on the road, keep the lights on, right? But not let that be too big a distraction. Try to start shifting the focus away from the maintenance in the past towards more the future. And, the thing is that, as I said, too much change is unsettling. And so in order to make this really work, right, take a small slice of the organization, top to bottom, not just teams, but management down to teams. Take that, implement it, learn from it, share the success. Because when you start getting success stories, you get people interested, like early adopters, then they want to be part of the Agile. And then you're bringing them on the journey, like selling customers a product. If you make them interested in the product, it's easier to get them to buy the product. But if you force a product on people, they'll go, man, it's not for me, or I'm not interested, right? So what you do is you generate interest and generate excitement, and then people want to be part of that journey rather than having a journey forced on them.
Right. So people have to buy, have to have their ownership in the process, and You
and make people feel like they are part of it. Invite feedback,
right.
show that you've listened to feedback, make people feel like they're involved.
Okay.
I mean, management doesn't have the answers. There's maybe lots of answers in that diversity of knowledge in the organization. So the more people feel they're involved, the more they want to be involved.
Right. And that brings me back to the transparency thing that we discussed earlier. So the thing is, and this question is about management hierarchy as compared to agile processes. I mean, there are sometimes people, the smaller business units, they tend to have this myopic opinion of their business unit and the C-suite, they assume that they have this bird eye view and then there is some, conflict of priorities. So then this later group of people C-suite, they assume that if we just start sharing everything with this smaller business unit, then it won't make a lot of sense. So do you think that there is some conflict of priorities here which can be aligned again with transparency? I mean, how we can bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think that transparency engenders trust and invites decision making. And I've said before, I think sometimes management's a silo. In a big organization with lots of layers, it's even more likely it'll be a silo. But even in quite small companies, if the founder is still in charge, then yeah, they've probably had a lot of success in the past. But sometimes it's difficult for them to let go of the fact that because it was successful in the past, the same things will bring them success in the future. They need to learn to change too. And sometimes for a founder, that's quite hard. So what I say to management is obviously it's a culture shift, it's a leadership shift. There's lots of things to do there, but even just simple things like management being less busy. Management's often too busy to have the conversations, or their diaries are chock-a-block, or they don't make themselves available, or they hold town halls, but it's a lecture. It's just the manager talking and everybody listening. There's no feedback, there's no dialogue. Well, that's a lecture, right? So actually have full-way discussions with your staff and invite that feedback. Be inclusive, listen to opinions, and show that change in management behavior, because and admit that you're human and management's human, so management gets things wrong, and saying we got things wrong, we learned from it. And that might help to stop things like the great resignation that's happening, which is evidence of management being very out of touch with what people want. And that what people want is becoming even more important now than it was in the past, because people are now feeling like they're empowered, they've got a voice, they've got choice, they've got flexibility. So the need to listen is even greater now than it ever was in the past.
Right. All right. So yes, that's very important. And before we conclude this podcast, my takeaways. I mean, if I can just roughly recall our 30 minutes chat. So include people in decision making. Feedback loops are important. Yes, there are legacies which organizations have, but then you got to have a stable backbone before you start achieving these dynamic capabilities. Do not go very tangent with that. So all of these little things. If you just have to summarize, Coburn, the entire conversation in a minute, or let's say a couple of minutes, what will be your advice to organizations trying to achieve all this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say management needs to lead, and management needs to be part of that transformation and show the way, and be human about that, and embrace the humanity aspects of it. And I'd say that the key things in a summary is understand the organizational context that you're really in now, get the data, understand your customers, understand the problem to be solved, understand the marketplace, see future shifts, and then go, this is where we want to be, this is where we need to be, this is when we need to get there. Now we recognize the value that Agile can bring to us. Therefore, that's what flavor of Agile, how much, how fast, in what way that's going to work best in our context, rather than just simply cut and paste what someone else did. Right? And you're going to get more success like that through having close feedback loops at every level, from your staff, from your customers, and your product delivery, than just copying a framework out of a book.
Right. So that sums it up really well. And future shifts, saying what is going to happen in future. we are going to cover this in next 2 weeks. This is, of course, this is all part of agility, all these moving parts, which apparently do not connect very well with these agile strategies, but they are so important. I mean, they in all these moving parts, they make a lot of sense. So thank you so much, Coburn, for joining us on this Friday. I guess it is end of your day already.
Yeah, it's 20 to 8 in the evening here, so it's the weekend.
Right. It's almost close to midnight in my part of the world. So thank you so much for we ate some part of your weekend already. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll be back with another episode with another exciting speaker next week. So thank you so much, Coburn, once more, and
Thanks for having me.
sure, our pleasure. Thank you. Have a great weekend.